Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Hello and welcome to the 20th episode of Quarantime. I'm Peter Hirschberg, and here with probably the largest group of people we've ever had on. You know, for 19 episodes now, we've talked about how people are reacting, how they're changing the way that they're adapting to communications, grief, to work, and to the problems that we're facing next, what our cities are going to be like, what the economy and business will be like, and the technologies that sit before us. For example, in last week's show with Steve Jurvetson and Andrew Heisel, or just before that, talking about cities with Kent Larson and the whole crew there. Today, we come to the question of how would we put this all together for the massive task ahead of collaborating and building, essentially, the world of tomorrow, especially when we have so many people who are still going to be at home for a while, and innovation communities that are kind of yearning to go put things together. How do the tools we have, the ways we tell stories, and the technologies in front of us, how might they come together? And we think that's going to be an interesting long-term project for us. So today is an experiment because we have a number of friends who think about this, and rather than ask them how it would work out, we've brought a bunch of people here today to do kind of a live open innovation session. So if you think about it, whenever we face a crisis, you have to tell stories about how you come out of that crisis. And joining us today will be Tim Kring. He's one of Hollywood's top storytellers. He created Heroes, and we did a lot of the early transmedia, social media work on how do you build a large audience and then motivate them for change. There's a lot of change communities out there, probably none bigger than Burning Man. Jen Sander joins us from Burning Man to check in on how that multiverse can take place, but more importantly, how global innovation communities can actually contribute and what that might look like. Then we're going to hear from platform creator Dan Mapes at Versus, creating the next version of the web that allows us to actually build for space, build for things, design something created in the physical world. And then we're going to move on to two more innovators, and then we're going to move on to how this is actually being executed in cities. So this is going to be quite an interesting show. One place to begin in setting all of this up is the notion that whenever we face a crisis, particularly in the United States, we actually do come together and tell stories. And one way we tell these stories, interestingly enough, is in World's Fairs. World's Fairs. You know, the first World's Fair held in the United States was held in 1876, 10 years after the Civil War. And of course, that starred people like Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell. It's where we were showing the beginning of the industrial age. San Francisco played a role of all of this. In 1915, we held the Panama Pacific Exposition. That's what San Francisco looked. That was San Francisco coming back from the earthquake. It was also San Francisco telling the 20th century, we have some ideas, and asserting what the future might look like. This happened again during the Depression. In 1939, in New York, there was the 1939 World's Fair, the World of Tomorrow, which, by the way, we're drawing inspiration from today because this show is called Building Tomorrow Together. And that deliberately came from a bunch of manufacturers coming together in the depths of the Depression thinking, we ought to explain what's next, show the technologies that are coming, give people some hope. And boy, it worked. It was about the most popular thing. Here you can see everybody lining up in front of General Motors Futurama Pavilion to hear about the future. But importantly, back then, people took their future sitting down. That is to say, they were the audience, and the generals told them what was going on. Now, when I say the generals, I mean General Motors, General Tires, General Electric, showing what the future might look like. Very different than today, in which we might design a future collaboratively with all of these networks that we talk about. The future in 1939 was the future of 1960. And today, of course, we're also concerned about a future 20 years out. It's kind of amusing to see what future they predicted. The future that was predicted then is the one we're trying to move away from now, automobile and carbon-based. But let's just take a look at the future as it was portrayed in the depths of one of America's last crises, the Depression.
And now we see a great river city of 1960. Here is an American city replanned around a highly developed, modern traffic system. On all express city thoroughfares, the rights of way have been so rooted as to displace outmoded business sections and undesirable slum areas whenever possible. A vast circular airport is close to the city with a giant dirigible hangar so that it can be turned easily to meet any wind direction. It is resting in a pool of liquid.
Alas, the pool of liquid did not come to pass. But one of the interesting things that we look at is when we're building futures together, why are we doing it? Well, I would argue that the American character is at its best when we have something to believe in. We're going to the moon, Reagan's sitting on the hill, even Manifest Destiny. We're a progress-oriented people, and we become kind of vile when we think that doesn't exist, and we kind of turn on each other a little bit like today. And so the interesting question is, do we have the tools, the clay, the capacity, the creativity, the stuff to go somewhere else? Before we move on and find out how, it's interesting to think back that in 1939, like imagine if you were going to build a city, a World's Fair, to tell everybody what the future would look like, you'd have to start a few years before. In fact, you'd have to start in around 1934, and what you'd need was a PowerPoint presentation. And they had a pitch book. The pitch book looked just like this. Omid, if we can go to the next slide. So in 1934, and if we open this thing up, by the way, they didn't have PowerPoint back then, so we had this. It was a giant book, kind of as big as I am, that presented the world of tomorrow, and it had all the industrialists and the leaders of nonprofits, the leaders of the technology. They envisioned a world along new lines. Well, here we find ourselves again in the depths of a troubling moment, a little bit of despair, and yet we're coming together on what tomorrow might look like. To begin to frame that, I want to turn to a good friend of this show and part of one of the great innovation communities on Earth, our friend Jen Sander. Hello, Jen.
Hey, Peter. Thank you so much
Hey.
for having me. Yeah, you know, I love the parallels between looking at co-creation and collaboration, and in particular with the World's Fair, because when you look at the World's Fair, you sometimes see how in the past it used to be less defined, undefined, and therefore more nations were showing up with different contributions. And as time went on, it became more defined, more prescriptive. And that's one of the things that we've really learned about with Burning Man is that, you know, the more undefined dialogues that you can create an opportunity for discovery and collaboration, the better the outcome. I used to come from a TED background before this, so I'm not unfamiliar to how difficult it is to actually encourage this co-creation that we're sort of speaking to. And it's super fascinating how really when you take away the prescriptive framing around what something might be, it then all of a sudden becomes more abundant from everyone and more bottom up and more emergent. And this moment in kind of the COVID pandemic, we are seeing that people are bringing a sense of vulnerability. You know, they're sitting around and chatting about things they weren't previously. And that sense of vulnerability has allowed for undefined knowledge share. And I think that's really the most exciting thing about what you just said and how we can kind of start to frame the opportunity of this program in that way.
Well, you know, as I said earlier, World's Fairs were always topped out because it was the countries or the companies. And there was even a World's Fair planned for this year in Dubai 2020 in the fall. It's been postponed. And even the Dubai government tried to do certain open innovation heats. But if you were to conceive of something today in this moment, it would really be collaborative. I have a quick question for you. You're close to the burner community. The burner community is on this multiverse experiment now because it's not happening in a place, it's happening everywhere. What are you seeing in terms of the energy and the ideas and the coming together, the creating of the momentum that we all might work together with?
Well, it's really interesting because the gaming industry and obviously the virtual potential of what's happening right now is one of the most interesting ways to create this sort of permission engine that we sometimes say at Burning Man, but kind of collaborative membrane with a set of guidelines that then encourage freedom and discovery within them. And while I don't really think that that's truly been fully exemplified in the digital realm as of yet, I think right now, because of all of the things going on in the space, there's more opportunity than ever to kind of differentiate and demonstrate that type of innovative potential or collaborative potential within it. And on the other side, the network mentality of true collaboration really requires real world engagement as well as digital. So it will be interesting to see how we're able to think more locally, not travel as much and apply that same kind of thinking, what we normally typically travel to Black Rock Desert for, applied to our local communities.
You've really set the challenge, right? It has to be collaboratively digital and physical in our cities. It has to be open-ended to allow creativity and specific to go to work on things, and really intentional because, unlike other times, there's a very clear set of problems and things that we need to do. Let's welcome Mickey. And Jen, we're going to get back to you a little bit later today in this conversation. And by the way, we're going to be checking in with you repeatedly because here's this giant Burning Man community of great potential. And I think what we're trying to do with this portion of Quarantime into the future is how do we connect up people who are going to work and inspire working on the future? So back to you in a moment. Mickey, hi there.
Hey, Peter. How you doing?
Okay, we're on quite a mission here. And as you know, in our next, so first of all, you should reintroduce us to Miro because our whiteboard, which has been our collaboration mechanism in stealth from the start, will be playing a more starring role.
And I think, so today I just started capturing and we've got just a few things already. Jen was talking about how does this whole idea of a World's Fair intersect with co-creation? We're noticing our vulnerability. How do we move from sort of the generals telling us the future from a top down to more of a bottom up and space for emergence? I remember last time Jen was on our show, she talked about actually trusting that, the third day would be blank because people would fill it in. And you can't really imagine, General Motors leaving a big chunk of the World's Fair empty and saying, oh, people will figure it out by the summer. We actually did have a little bit of that in the World's Fair, in the Columbian Exposition in 1893 in Chicago, famously documented by the Devil in the White City book, where the main fair was very orchestrated, but there was a midway. It was sort of this place where people could come and create a, sort of exotic dancing from Egypt and Africa and other things, and people could go visit different kinds of things. And so the midway was kind of a way that people could actually bring in entertainment and different ideas from the local areas from making all sorts of things. But generally, there isn't kind of space for emergence. And I do think that's, I liked your sort of the brief from the 1930s to prepare for the 1939, the Paris Fair and everything. And it was sort of, Zeppelins will be docking. Whatever happened to Zeppelins? Anyway, so I've got the whiteboard. One of the things I want to just point out is there's a link right on our Quarantime site. So everybody who's watching this, whether you're watching it now or later, it's asynchronous. It's an infinite whiteboard. If I pull back, you can actually kind of go back and see previous episodes. You could tell I missed an episode. And you can see, oh, wow, last Friday we were talking to Steve Jurvetson, and he was talking about his thesis about investing in SpaceX. I think a little later today, SpaceX is going to try launching. And Andrew Hessel, who was talking about sort of creating push-button fabs for entire genomes. And we almost think as the first 20 episodes or the first 19 episodes is season 1. Season 2, starting today, we're going to actually give you a challenge. And so at the end of this, I'm going to ask you to all join the Miro and look at our challenge, because the first challenge will be detecting weak signals. Everyone will become an archaeologist between now and next Wednesday to actually harvest what we learned in the last 20 episodes to contribute to an emergent sort of World's Fair, or how do we basically create tomorrow together. So I should get out because you got lots of people that want to talk. But anyway, if anyone wants to join, you can go to our Miro, onto our Quarantime site. We're not sponsored by them or anything, but there's a link. You can click on it, and you don't have to log in. You can be completely anonymous, but you can draw on this in a different place than I'm drawing on it. It's just a big infinite whiteboard.
We, when you come into these things, this whole question of how do you engage your audience with you, and how do you tell a story that you believe in? This question is, do we have something to believe in now? One of the great experimenters in this is Tim Kring, who is a television creator of Crossing Jordan and Heroes, but really is one of the first to start co-creating with the audience and also telling hero's journey stories. So Tim, welcome.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
Hey there. It's so great to see you again. We got to know each other probably 10 years ago or so when you were experimenting with the very beginning of transmedia. And one of the reasons we wanted to invite you in is, here we have the tech community, the Burning Man community, the innovation community, but this is really about telling stories and this notion that people are motivated when they can believe in a future. That was a lot of the premise of Heroes, creating extraordinary people and then motivating the audience to almost become part of a movement. I'd love to have you share with us kind of how storytelling community might be approaching this moment and what you learned from early social media.
Listen, I started really with the simple premise of really wanting to reach the audience where they live. There was, the audience was starting to flee traditional television. And so we were just trying to figure out, well, how to fish where the fish were. And my whole idea of an audience was really kind of a one-way street. I didn't really ever think about them very much, to be honest. We pushed content out into the world. A couple of months after we made it, people would view it, and we would get a kind of binary thumbs up, thumbs down, critique from the audience based on the ratings. And it wasn't until this show Heroes that I did where I really wanted to try and figure out how to have a more dynamic relationship with an audience that was suddenly incredibly connected to one another. And I began to see that that by creating this dynamic relationship with an audience, it became a two-way street as opposed to a one-way street, where we would push content to them and they would push content back, or at least reaction. So it became sort of a dynamic loop. And one of the things that I really noticed with fandom is that people's connection to a narrative, especially one like Heroes that was really intended to have a message of saving the world. It was really about a very deep message of interconnectivity and global consciousness. That's what the show was about. So I wanted it to have that sort of aura to it. But I began to realize that people really wanted a place and a platform to create their own personal expression out of, around and inside of a narrative that they could live inside of. And when you go to Comic-Con, let's say, if those of you who have had the unique pleasure of going to a Comic-Con, you see that people will come from miles, from vast distances to come to Comic-Con to sort of bask inside of a narrative that they love. They create these handmade costumes. They stand in line for endless hours to get a glimpse of a show creator or someone, or a star. And it is that sense of personal expression that really was a light bulb moment for me, where I realized if you could harness this idea of people wanting to live inside of a narrative, give them a way to participate in that narrative and have some sort of real world positive result happen, it could be an extraordinarily powerful thing. And so out of this kind of think tank, if you will, and incubator of heroes and fan base there, we created a project called Conspiracy for Good that did exactly that allowed people to become a character inside of a narrative. And as a result of that, we were able to, it ostensibly was a giant scavenger hunt sponsored by Nokia, who at the time had, I think, something like 76% of the global market share in handsets. And it became a giant scavenger hunt, sort of, on the streets of London and on the internet, and using their version of the iTunes store. And as a result of people's participation in that narrative, we ended up building and stocking 5 libraries in Africa and giving away, 50 scholarships to schoolgirls and donating 10,000 books and that sort of thing. So my journey has really been one of trying to understand and relate to an audience and motivate them to participate in the world with the goal of creating and promoting positive change.
I mean, it strikes me that this was, you could almost argue the Conspiracy for Good was a rehearsal moment for this moment when suddenly we actually do need, I would imagine, a narrative people can believe in, a way for people to participate and not feel alienated, left out, or trolly, right? Yep. So, and so kind of what I think what we're all interested in is it possible to build those kind of narratives now? By the way, I wanted to show a little clip of Conspiracy for Good, because one of the interesting things about it was this was kind of the dawn of smartphones and the ability to do location-based play. So
it was early on in that sort of.
What year was this?
2010. So there was we were using a very early image recognition toolkit that is nowhere near what.
Let's roll that clip, and then we'll bring ourselves up to today. We're now waiting for Omid to remotely start the clip. And Omid has not found the media. So in that case, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to describe what happened.
Right. Well, again, Conspiracy for Good was we had 130 people working on this project for over a year and a half. It was a giant experiment, if you will, in the kind of transmedia storytelling where we took story, divided it up among things like mobile, gaming, sort of online, scavenger hunt, ARG, all of that, and then ultimately onto the streets of London in a kind of real world live theater experiment that lasted 4 days, where people ran around using this early image recognition technology to try and find clues to the story. And there were villains and bad guys and good guys and all of that. And people along the way would sort of find underground concerts where we had, up to 5,000 people show up to these concerts. And but again, as a result of your participation inside of this narrative, you were learning a lot about sort of certain, sort of causes and philanthropic ideas and having to interact with that. And ultimately, the payoff was the releasing of these funds and the building of these libraries and donating books and all of that. So the experiment was really how to take a narrative, roll it out into the real world, and have something positive happen.
What are your thoughts?
And as you said, right now, I mean, 10 years later, it's a completely, you now have we're all carrying around in our pockets these devices that are, not only a content consumption device, but a content creation device. They know where your friends are. They have, these capabilities of AR, and it's an extraordinarily powerful tool for telling story. And I think you can live inside of a narrative much easier in a mobile experience now, and especially with 5G coming, it's going to be the time is really right for this.
Tim Chang, venture capitalist, is going to join us a little later in the show, had a post yesterday talking about how in this moment, we've all been on Zoom. We're beginning to realize that we want more emotional engines. We have gaming and online stuff coming together. People are looking for experiences. So we're seeing this conversion of media. And but we're up here in Silicon Valley. So the role of big storytelling and television, what you do, seems to be important here. And the other piece that I'm interested in is, one thing we've seen is social media has evolved. We've become more polarized. We've seen this in Facebook. We've seen this in political stuff. What's the role of hero's journey and storytelling, perhaps to reverse some of that, or to kind of get everybody on a similar side and working together? Is there role for that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm suddenly very fascinated, and I mean, I'm consumed by the polarized world that we live in, but I'm also really fascinated with how to take advantage of scaling people's passions locally, how to scale those up in a socially connected and social media world. And actually, I've been working for the last 6 months. I don't know whether you have some of the stuff that, you know, to share on this, but a project that my 20-year-old son actually it was his brainchild, and it's a project called Here, and it came out of his desire that people his age, a Gen Z sort of generation, were overwhelmed by the fact that these giant problems that seem to be out there are overwhelming and paralyzing to them. And what could they do just being here in their lives? And here is a word that, you know, is it's obviously got a physical component to it, but it also has an existential component. Why am I here? What am I here for? What do I believe in? And so I'm really consumed now with this idea of how people can declare to the world and talk about the things that they are really passionate, especially in a world that is awash and overwhelmed by a gazillion hashtags of topics. How do you discern from the vast noise that's out there to really distill down to the things that you're passionate about, to find others who are passionate about those?
Let's play that clip, because I think that will inspire us to kind of talk about
Tim,
that.
one of the things, before you play the clip, one of the things that I thought was pretty fascinating with your son's idea was this notion that today we have these kind of shortcuts that the Gen Z and other people use. Like an @ symbol means a particular location.
Yes.
And a hashtag is sort of a topic.
Topical.
You know, right? So folksonomy. But I think he's trying to say, look, there might be a new one that's an ethical tag.
Yes.
But like this is greater than me. This is something that I'm here for. This is the ethical and the cause that I'm interested in. But there's no ethical button there.
That's
People
right.
like things, does that mean they like it? Yeah. It's a fascinating idea.
Aside, I think he came up with a brilliant idea. I mean, a really, really game-changing idea. And so we've been working on it together.
Let's take a look at it.
Let's go ahead and watch this.
Yeah.
And then we're going to use that to inspire the rest of our show. Go ahead.
Can actually tell you how to use the product. Service is extremely important.
So the lag time in the Wi-Fi sort of messes with the flow of the video, but I think you sort of get the idea. I don't know whether you have the deck there to click through that explains it a little bit more.
We don't. Why don't you give us a quick?
Okay, so basically, I mean, because the deck really explains it. The whole idea is that of Here is that there is we come up with the idea that there is a third symbol. There are only two signs in all of social media there that people use. There is the @ sign, which is a sort of personal locator to locate where to find you on your email and what your personal handle is. Then there is the hashtag, which is sort of topical. And we came up with the idea, my son came up with this idea that there is another sign. It is the less than symbol found on every keyboard. And that less than symbol stands for here for. It's what you what you are here for. And it's here for meaning that the thing that you are most passionate about, the thing that you want to stand up and declare to the world. So you use it by putting your name or your handle, then what you're here for. If you're here for Extinction Rebellion or Greenpeace or whatever it is that you're here for, or here for a candidate, or here for something you believe in. But it's the idea of being able to use another keystroke, another sign that discerns among all of the chaos out there to sort of show what you most deeply care about. So in a sea of 1 billion people speaking out in the internet on any one day, all of them using hashtags, if 1 million of them are talking about climate change and using this sign, then you can find all those people. You can aggregate that. You can somehow find it, point that towards people.
So I like this idea, Tim. I tried to capture it really quickly. I'm doing the best I can, keeping up with you. I probably need a lot more people doodling sometimes. So and of course anyone is welcome. But so location was the @ symbol, topic was the hashtag or the folksonomy, and this idea of taking the less than, effectively what you're saying is this cause is greater than me.
Yes,
and I am less than this cause, that this is something bigger than me.
In a world where
I can't do it my own. This needs collective ethical action.
Exactly. Thing. And the idea that for people my son's age, the Gen Z especially, the world to them is a whole, it's kind of this chaotic sort of look at me, here's what I'm all about. This sort of constant sort of presenting yourself out to the world as something that is super important and really valuable. And this allows you to say there are some things that I deem greater than me, that I want to point a megaphone towards. And that act of declaration, that act of declaring that I am here for something, I think has the potential to have the same kind of dopamine effect that a like button does when you get a like. To just be able to stand up and declare what you are here for, what you are sort of existentially believing.
I think the other day when he was kind of giving us a sense of this, he was talking about, there's the fear, and I think there's the fear of even trivializing something down to a symbol, right? Which is a lot of the fear of emoticons and all that stuff is the value falsification. Unless people leave their seats and go outside, they're slacktivists. They're not activists.
That's right.
And in fact, in certain despotic countries, they've got algorithms that just stop anybody from ever. They have tear down automatically through algorithms. Anytime you say, let's meet tomorrow, they take that down. They're happy with you saying bad things about the government because people are slacktivists. But the minute you say, let's get together tomorrow afternoon, that's taken down by the censors.
Yeah.
The Great Wall of China, this is very well known. And so the Great E-Wall of China. And so how do we make sure that this concept, and I think the narrative is the important part here too, is how do we get this narrative that says, not only am I willing to say, I am less than this big thing, this is an ethical thing I care about, but then how do I explore what it means? What are the normative values that it means to be ethically for this or against this or inspired by this? And how do I get off my butt? How do I do something?
Yeah.
And so many of the people that we have today are they get off their butt every day and they are doing things. They're sort of making and then going back and going, what the hell did I just make? Which is a very powerful way of learning and engaging with the world.
We're putting on the table today really all of these new mechanisms, or if we're going to go create a future, what might it be? And you've added both narrative and new symbology to this. One of the interesting.
By the way, let me just say this is completely in beta. We're sharing this very early.
Yeah.
We have not launched yet. We're conceptualizing, strategizing how to market it, how to start to launch it.
Tim, today's show is an alpha. Today's show is deliberately taking people from different worlds and seeing what will happen. And that's why I wanted to bring on our next guest, Dan Mapes. And I want you to stick around and watch this. So if we're going to work together to go build a world of tomorrow, we need more than the social media tools of just speaking 1.0 or even the 2.0 stuff that allowed us to do what you're doing with Heroes and social media. We need tools that let us to imagine what a world would be like, digitally create it, physically build it, have what we call digital twins, or what Nikki likes to call digital crash dummies, where people can simulate things and then make that stuff real. And and that becomes the world of simulation and the work that Dan is doing. So Dan, let's bring up Dan Makes. Howdy. Oh, and I think you need to turn your microphone on.
Hey, Peter.
So
hey,
Dan,
Mickey.
you're building
Good to be here.
tools.
Hi, Dan.
Hello. You're building tools that let us express ourselves in augmented and virtual reality, which we of course know from gaming and artificial worlds. But much of your work is once we design these things, we can run simulations, then we can deploy them in the real world to build our buildings or to build our artwork and get more and more people involved. And this is kind of where the internet is going. And then we're going to come back to Tim a little bit later because how could we use this as entertainment? And then we're going to go forward to Podway and our entrepreneurs and just think about how this all comes together. But tell us a little bit about your journey, or should we start with that little video?
Maybe I'll set it up for a minute first. If we look back,
go ahead. Set it up for you. Great.
Yeah, no. Human beings are tool makers, tool users. We define our history. Even that was the Stone Age, or that was the age of the hunter-gatherers. Then we invented agriculture. That was the agricultural age. Then we invented mass production, the printing press, and now we make our cars and furniture and everything on mass production in factories. So we kind of define ourselves by the tools and how that impacts and creates an economy, and then how that actually then goes to create a society. And in 1944, we invented a new tool, which was extremely revolutionary. That was the first programmable computer that was used to crack the code, the German cipher code, to help us win World War II. And those computers have moved forward to this day till we're carrying them around in our pockets and purses and calling them smartphones, but they're actually very, very powerful supercomputers. And so if we watch the march of evolution, 1944 to 1969 was 25 years. We went from one computer to 40,000 computers in the world by 1969. Then we decided, hey, gee, we should network those computers. So we networked 4 of them together, and that began the internet in 1969. That grew to 4 million computers in 1994 when the World Wide Web launched. And now we are 25 years later, and we're inventing a new layer to the web called the spatial web. And now there are 40 billion computers plugged into it. So we really trust humanity over time. If we can increase the quality of the tools, they will figure out really cool things to do with them, and society will evolve and will solve problems we were never able to solve before. So we're in that lineage. We're writing new software and tools that the kids that have grown up in computer gaming will completely recognize and learn how to gamify the world we're living in. So that's kind of the foundation for Versus.io, that is my company, and the spatial web, which is our new protocol and technology stack.
Let's bring Mickey back. Mick, why don't you join us for a second?
Yeah.
I want to talk about this notion of, people talk about digital twins. What you're really talking about is if you're designing something in a city, you can model it, right? And then you can use that to go build it. But once it sits in a model, you can test it, stress test it, mess with it. Lots of people can share it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to get people to stop talking about digital twins just because I think it's first of all, we don't have a lot of experiences with digital with physical twins and identical twins and dizygotic twins and right. But we do actually understand what a stunt double is. You know, we just saw the great movie with Brad Pitt, who was a stunt double who got called in right when anything really hard had to be tested out. You know, and he would fall off the horse and he would do those things. And so how do we build digital stunt doubles so that we can fail on the Earth that's in the simulation before we fail on the actual Earth? You know, how do we put it in the fire? How do we learn from actually simulating the complexities involved? And so I'd rather us have digital stunt doubles. You know, wait, take a break. We got to pull in the stunt double and run this. And I think what Dan is doing is he's saying, you know, could there be a layer that has some kind of way to identify every, you know, atom on the planet or every location on the planet, and effectively be as lightweight as a web protocol. Ultimately, we're going to have to scale to more than one planet. We're going to have more like a planetary file system, and we're going to have ways to make sure they're not locked inside of servers. A few years back, my lab published a book called Trillions, which was about what would happen if we actually were in a trillion node network, not just 8 billion, because nature laughs at that. And I do think we have to kind of plan for the way nature has survived, which is hybrid vigor and this notion of having a way that we can identify the phenomena in the world and we can test it before we screw up the world. And I think that's what Dan is working towards, is how do we add a layer to the web, which is kind of a very simple protocol for pointing at things with links.
And one of the reasons
on top of the internet, and it's not the internet, it's this thing on top. And how do we layer a different protocol for the spatial web, so that we can then start to have both virtual and physical.
One of the reasons we're here right now is, as we've all been at home and using these new tools, and we're trying to create, everybody feels like they're leaning into what's next. Let's take a look at this video. It just gives us a little taste of that, and then we'll bring in some people who are beginning to use this stuff.
There's a new world emerging right before our very eyes. A world where we seamlessly and naturally interact with augmented and virtual reality, opening endless possibilities to learn, collaborate, create, and explore. Where spaces and cities become smart, physical and digital goods are tracked, and people's identity, security, and finances are protected, enabling citizens, big data, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things to finally work together for the benefit of humanity and the planet. Versus has developed the HSTP, or Hyperspace Transfer Protocol, allowing parties to agree on who, what, and where everything is in physical and virtual worlds. This enables anyone with the right permissions to discover what something is, who owns it, where it's located, and what can be done with it. Join us and our many forward-thinking partners and industry leaders as we drive the next generation of innovation and lay down the digital infrastructure to support a better future and a new web for people, businesses, our environment, and humanity. Let's build the spatial web.
Dan, let's have James Hanusa join us here.
Sure.
He's been working with you. James, you're very backlit, but that's okay. As we used to say on radio, the shadow knows.
Peter, I'd like to comment one thing about what Mickey said before the video clip. And that is, Mickey, I completely agree. I mean, in a way, I was thinking about this project early on. We really love spreadsheets. We can do what ifs. We can try out various scenarios, and we can look at low, medium, and high possibilities. And we can see, if we change this, what will that do to the overall result? And so really one of the things that we're doing, I think, with the spatial web and with the digital twinning or smart twinning of the world, or smart dummying, is we're creating a three-dimensional spreadsheet. We can run what if scenarios on it. And look what happened in 1997. Artificial intelligence grew up to a point where it actually beat Garry Kasparov for the World Chess Championship. And even in 2011, it beat the Jeopardy champions, even using the subtleties of the English language. So we do have a partner in managing our cities and managing our planet now that we've never had before, and that is artificial intelligence. So once you've got this in a three-dimensional spreadsheet, I mean, AIs can run 1 million simulations for you really quickly, and then deliver. Here are some optimal results. We still get to make final choices, but wow, what a great new assistant we have.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And I think I like where you're going with this, because it's the notion of having an index that lets you point to something both in the physical world, but also it's digital kind of, I was saying stunt double or whatever, but whatever it might be. Spreadsheets are a nice example, because spreadsheets were the first example of a generative tool, right? They were very simple, and they allowed end user scripting, right? Joe in accounting could write code in it, but he could copy it and give it to all the sales guys to fill out for expense reports. And so the end user, not the big corporation, but the people who knew their business could script something. So it was very open-ended in what we would call a generative tool. And having Versus be sort of a generative tool for us to be able to explore the spatial sort of boundaries between digital and physical feels very powerful.
And this is an invitation.
That's the key idea. Yeah.
We're bringing more people in than just architects and designers. James, you're working with Versus with cities like Reno, and I think Scottsdale, on how artists and people can respond to projects in cities and create these. And tell us a little bit about how this draws a broader innovation audience in to actually be able to react in big projects in the real world better. Well,
yeah,
do we hear James?
I would say we're modeling. Yeah, yeah. I would say we're modeling right now more than working with. So we are using those cities, and we're, for example, we've been in conversations with the Museum of Tomorrow in Rio de Janeiro, and we have been obviously with Reno, have been looking at the economy there and the community there for a number of years. Based on the proximity, I talk about it as the adjacent possible to Black Rock City. Phoenix has got one of the most advanced smart region and smart state initiatives that I've ever come across since I've been working on cities, smart cities, etc. So the theme that as artist in residence for Verses that I got to explore, that I chose to explore over the last 3 months or so, was how to actualize this concept of SDG, so UN Sustainable Development Goals, smart cities with the art capitalized. So how do you bring creativity, technology, and purpose together at city scale and make it participatory, make it fun, make it creative? I think that's really where we will be going. I think that from smart cities to art cities, I've talked about before, where it is the co-creation that makes it, the place people want to be.
You're connecting up a number of themes you had. Like Jen at the very beginning talked to us about open-endedness and art, and we think of taking cities seriously, but of course cities are incredibly creative. Let's bring up the smart cities diagram, because this Dan really shows us the idea of some of the things that we can control both seriously and in a fun way. So Omid, you have the graphic of that? By the way, Omid is in yet another city today, so what we're looking at is a slightly lagged Wi-Fi. However, we're in a completely distributed environment, so at least we get to keep talking. There we go. So the here is that. Go ahead, Dan.
So I think in the Reno example, and I'll let Dan speak to this, but I think things like Reno's got an Amazon delivery warehouse, right? A logistics hub, regional logistics hub. So can they use drone paths and geofencing around airports and do drone delivery, as a test of innovation in the Reno region or elsewhere? Similarly with autonomous vehicles, right? Of course the Tesla Gigafactory is there, but if some other German car maker or something wants to partner with Verses on figuring out autonomous vehicle traffic flows and controls, might be another good place, because Nevada has some of the most cutting edge legislation around autonomous vehicles and has been testing this for many, many years. Dan, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, as you can see from this image, this kind of looks like a little bit of a city game. And so when you're in a game like Fortnite or World of Warcraft or any of these big games, the game knows about everything that's going on in the game, and everything is interoperable in the game. But that's not the way our cities are right now. They're bureaucratic, they're broken up. We've seen with COVID-19 that we can't even figure out where things are, or how many ventilators there are, or where the masks are, or how to move people around. I mean, it's just a mess. So by gamifying our city, we suddenly, to do it, we have to make everything interoperable. And that's what HTTP did for web pages. We now have 6 billion web pages made by millions of individual people separately. So now our cities now, with this new HTTP protocol, people can actually make web spaces and link them together interoperably. So now you've got your autonomous vehicles and drones that you talked about, James, totally aware and interacting with the electricity grid and everything else in the city, so that the whole city kind of functions in an optimized way where AIs can help the humans in figuring out what are the most optimal solutions around traffic, around carbon emissions, around other kinds of things. So once you've got this interoperable model, then your city can slowly refine itself and become more and more sustainable and really hit the sustainable development goals that the UN has articulated, because cities are basically responsible for some very large percentage, maybe even half of our global pollution.
I'm excited for a little bit in the future in the show when we bring Tim back and he pitches us his new series that uses all of these tools in the creation of the series and the creation of a world. But to learn more about that, let's bring our next guest in, Ivo Henning. Ivo has, was trained at MIT, has been doing work in interactive and collaborative media for years. And as we were discussing yesterday, in this COVID crisis, people are rediscovering this whole tool set. And you've really been looking at how they've been beginning to be applied to activism and collaborative work in the middle of this crisis and beyond. So I'd love you to share some of what you're seeing and help paint the picture of where this all may lead.
Absolutely. Hi, gentlemen. This has been a
your
fantastic...
microphone needs to be on. And it is. Hi.
Am I here or not? Can you hear me?
Yes.
No? Yes.
Yes,
fantastic.
Yes.
This has been such a fantastic conversation, y'all. Thank you so much. We've been doing some of these types of transmedia campaigns for now almost 20 years. The mix of streaming, world building, gameplay, and asking the audience to participate in some way, right? So that's where transmedia, that was that nexus point that Tim was pointing to over a decade ago. And now we're seeing it in Fortnite, for example, in fundraisers, in raves in Animal Crossing, where you're seeing intergenerational play around virtual events. But also in the use of VR platforms for conferences in the current status of not being able to come together. How do we come together in new ways? So game worlds, that was one of the pieces that both Jen and Mickey spoke to that we're seeing just taking off tremendously, using game worlds for education, for fundraisers, for bringing people together, for collaboration in ways that you never would have expected, right? So using Half-Life Alyx in VR to do education, to do lessons, but also thinking about, okay, we want to connect people together, but we're in 20 different worlds. How do we find each other? And so this is where we've had a chance to collaborate on some of the things that James is working on, some of the communities of burners that are putting together interesting events. And currently we're also working on a new delivery for San Francisco Pride using augmented reality art in the community. So again, taking those elements of streaming and allowing everyone to participate in the experience and create a community art city that is generated by the people and for the people and gives people a safe way to connect again, even if it's from their cars or in a new way, because we still crave the midway, we still crave the parade. And so that's why Playable Agency exists. I joined up with the guys from Mystic Midway, started finding great artists to work with, and we had started building immersive and interactive experiences that do these mixed reality components, what Dan is describing in terms of using data around smart cities in playable ways, right? We can begin to design not just events, but challenges that unlock opportunities together, right? So like massively multiplayer media, and that can be applied to any challenge, to any type of issue. So we started our team at Playable in January, and I've had a chance to collaborate with a few of these guys here, James most recently, but also with Tim and DIY Days a decade ago. The work that Tim Kring and Lance Weiler and many of the folks in the transmedia scene have been doing is laying the groundwork for this synthesis of streaming, social media, gameplay, and world building all in one place.
So Ivo, you mentioned sort of in the comments as we were kind of getting ready for this that, you know, the transmedia stuff from Heroes. And by the way, I remember Heroes when it was sort of, you know, when it first came out, and because I was a big fan, I remember explicitly save the cheerleader, save the world. But I also remember like they would talk about some random business, and if you went to the website, you found the real business, and you're like, wait a second, is this a real thing? Is this? So for those of you who never saw Heroes, it was a kind of a magical thing, because you'd find out a comic book led to something else, and then you mentioned in your comments that Jane McGonigal's work, right? So she wrote the book Reality is Broken, and really started coming up with sort of super good or games that would actually help break through reality. Can you say a little bit more about like tangible things you've learned in this transmedia thing to actually help with making reality better. You know, like something you've worked on that you can point to like that.
Well,
it's like, yeah, it was a real world game, but it ended up creating some other things along the way, or it was super good.
I would say that some of these are relationships that unfold over sometimes a decade. So I'm still collaborating with folks I met playing Urgent Evoke as the game master in 2011 because I helped out and got involved in Conspiracy with Tim. So finding these networks, I still collaborate with folks from Second Life in 2006 because we did a campaign together and we come back and collaborate again. So it's almost like guild building in World of Warcraft, but we have these social impact guilds and we find each other again and say, hey, I know you care about this, I care about this. Can we build an alliance and do more together?
I like this idea of guild building. And some of these things, they're not just going to happen in the time you're playing the game, or they're not going to happen in the time you're doing this. And how do we invite? You mentioned intergenerational play, right? And I feel very strongly about this. You know, how do we have grandkids playing with grandparents? How do we actually? Sometimes a grandparent can ask a question or answer a question about a mom or a dad that the mom or dad can't answer because the grandparent remembers them when they were 6 years old, and they can answer to the 6-year-old. You know, so I think this feels powerful because it's not about just an event, but it's actually like you sort of build this almost network of superheroes. And I've always learned that high performance teams don't stay together, like they self-destruct. And they get together. It's the Avengers, it's the heroes. They do something, but Thor kind of hates Iron Man a little bit, or maybe they're broken in some places and they fit together, they solve a problem, but then they go off and have their own adventures, and then you get to like say we're bringing the band back together. Let's do something, and that feels very powerful.
And we're designing a narrative right now that I can't speak too much to right now that does exactly that. But using, for example, augmented reality, you can unlock that intergenerational play. Augmented reality and apps themselves allow for instance, a grandparent to leave a challenge for a grandchild that they're going to find later, or
like
for a
in
teacher
the room. Yeah,
I
like it.
Let's bookmark this remarkable conversation about the tools and the narrative we have, connecting back to this new development technology and back to storytelling, and then think back to where we started talking about our cities and world's fairs. Because one key thing is this is both virtual and physical, and of course, what we're really talking about is what's next for America, what's next in our cities. How do we take the technologies we've talked about and build something thriving? And I mean, if there was to be a World's Fair, that's what we talk about. But we realize it isn't just a World's Fair, it's what's going on today in our cities. So for that, I'd like to bring in Dr. Pondway Gibson. Now, Dr. Gibson has been doing remarkable work with advanced technologies and advanced manufacturing. You've really been at the head, by the way, you've been at the head of this maker and local manufacturing movement, which is actually dear to my heart. I wrote the book, The Maker City, which is when you and I first met. Mickey was at Autodesk. We met over talking about advanced manufacturing. But I'd love you to tell us about your incubator and your approach, because you seem to be bringing together the technologies that matter, ways that American manufacturing can thrive in an era of new supply chains, and a way of bringing back our secondary cities, because we've overinvested in a few cultural
but wait, cities. Just Pondway, please, just first, who are you? A little background. Peter asks very complicated questions. It takes me a while to parse
because I'm so excited.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking that question. So I'm the granddaughter of the first Black regional director of the IRS for the Midwest region. And his wife, my grandmother, and her sister worked on the Manhattan Project in Chicago as a result of the major experiment after World War II that Vannevar Bush facilitated as the innovation czar under Roosevelt, to really create the innovation frameworks that our country is now thriving on, right? So I come from innovators, I come from scientists, I come from extremely financially prudent individuals on both sides of my family. And so I love that you asked that question, because I constantly ground everything I do in my ancestors and the sort of foundation they laid. And Then another layer to that is really presencing what's happening in this moment as we're on this call having this conversation. So right now in the world, in Minnesota, a Black man was lynched after 5 minutes in public, and there is a riot going on. And right now at Cape Canaveral, there is a launch of the first manned flight in almost a decade in a public-private partnership, finally again, like we had in the World War II era. You're seeing these collaborations generate something that can ideate a new future. And so what I loved about what I heard earlier in the conversation, and sort of what I want to latch on to as I talk about the work that I do, is the idea of collaboratively digital and specific work that's focused on the future. And so I'm from New Orleans. New Orleans and Chicago, so I think probably the two greatest cities in the country. And so went to school in California and at Scripps College, private liberal arts environment in SoCal. And then Hurricane Katrina hit. And I knew I needed to get home and make a difference and be with my family. But I was 22, and I also was mature enough to know that nobody would listen to me, even though I thought I had the answers to all the problems in the world at the time, or at least the ones in New Orleans. So I went to Harvard. And while at Harvard, I wrote a framework, a charter called Renew. And ultimately, that was my first startup. So I took that model to New Orleans. We opened 16 schools over the course of 3 years. I was the founding principal of one of those schools, and as such, recruited to do that work across DC and Philadelphia. When I got to DC, I was probably there for 6 months. And one of my children in New Orleans was murdered, my students.
Wow.
And that was absolutely devastating, if you could imagine, and had me really start to rethink about how to make transition. So why were my schools so successful? I mean, we ranked in state. We had a 100-piece band marching at Mardi Gras. I mean, it was like one of those turnaround stories you see in the movies. And I fundamentally think why I was successful was I was doing the model I was taught at Harvard. That's it. I'm a good cook. I know how to follow a recipe, and I followed the recipe about how you build a sustainable organization. And they were data based, they were science based, they were art based institutions, and we just followed that model to create a innovation petri dish. But it happened to be within a school system, and we engage multiple stakeholders, right, in the community to make it work. But something hit me when I lost my student, which was social systems in their structure are not sustainable, because it depends so much on the person. And you can't help children if you don't create economic opportunities for the adults in their environment, was one of the main realization. And the second was, what is the point of teaching anybody the periodic table? Like, why know that AG is silver if the majority of jobs in an ecosystem are service jobs? So like punching a button on a cash register. That's a picture of a burger. And right now we're in the post-COVID reality where you have people saying that 40% of the jobs are not going to come back into the marketplace. So from there, I looked around the country for where an opportunity is. I decided to go south. I went to Miami. Miami at the time was doing the deep dredge. So the deep dredge is now Miami is one of the only ports on the eastern seaboard, and particularly in the south, that can take supermax ships. So huge opportunity in terms of trade and logistics. And in 2015, the Panama Canal was reversing. So huge opportunities for trade and logistics in terms of Miami positioning itself to be like Singapore, in terms of being an innovation hub and an opportunity to sort of engage in that advanced manufacturing movement that was happening or is happening around the world. So I went to Miami. I started Ecotech. I put $250,000 of my own money in, built up a prototype, got my first investor, a main headquarters facility, went to MIT, where I really honed and framed the model And the model is very much about distributive smart manufacturing. So disrupting the supply chain. It's taking the shared economy model to the supply chain industry, and really bringing innovation back to the people who are the innovators.
So this is your current effort, Ecotech. Man, I could probably sit
Mickey, I
just
can't hear you.
interview.
I can see your lips
Uh-oh.
moving.
Oh, this happens occasionally. Mickey's completely excited about all this, and we were talking about your. Can you hear Mickey now?
Hello, hello, hello. If not,
so Dr. Gibson, this bit about distributed manufacturing has been on the agenda for a while, and I think one of the things that you can perhaps bring us through is the fact that there are certain industries and capacities that it really favors. So, right, you're actually adapting things like green and aerospace, and there's certain industries that we can just excel in what's next. So walk us through a little bit of that vision.
Sure. So Ecotech focuses on 5 major verticals or 5 major industries that I research and that many of the head professors in digital currency initiative, et cetera, focus on. So space tech, and that's why I'm so excited about the space launch. I also sort of dabbled in aerospace while I was at MIT, but it's really terraforming products. Like, for example, the espresso machine was initially made for space, and now we have use here on Earth. But that conversation that we were just having about abundance, right? Like, how do you envision a world for trillions of people, a universe, a reality of trillions? Is that you have to have a space for this reality and innovation within that, coming from everybody, not just, the few that can afford to go to MIT.
So I want to jump in and see if my voice is working now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
So by the way, anybody who wanted to just leave this weird, blurry Blurs Day and follow the Cape Canaveral thing, it's been scrubbed, I think, until Saturday, some kind of weather thing. So there'll be a party on Saturday. But I love this idea of this. You mentioned sort of distributed supply chain, distributed manufacturing. Tell us about like what the first thing you're working on is, because you just talked about a few different things, but what's the first thing that you're making some progress on in this kind of idea that you're pushing?
So we're a little more than an idea. We have 52,000 square feet of space in Miami.
Beautiful.
We have an in-house trucking and logistics company. We have 26 companies physically operating in our facility and another 57 in the virtual community. Our go-to-market strategy is the virtual community and marketplace. So the idea is that I started with my ancestors, but moved on to some of the things that are happening in the world today. And right now, people use social media to sort of self-indulge or to complain. And what we've built is a social network that is fundamentally about seeding innovation, an opportunity for entrepreneurs to develop and seed innovation, to learn, work together, to develop channel partners together. And I'll give you some concrete examples and ideas. So we have a solar company that is physically working out of our space, as well as a company that makes shipping container homes. We also, as an organization, build with our companies, help them get contracts, help build with them, help capitalize these different projects. But shipping container home company doing, affordable housing, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom. We connected them with the solar company, because if you're going to do sustainable housing, why not connect with the local channel partner and be able to go after larger bids with larger organizations? But they met up in the virtual community and then can partner together. So it's not a traditional incubator. I only use that word to help people sort of wrap their mind around what we're doing. But it's kind of like, how did people understand what Airbnb or Uber was before it existed? The word literally needed to be added to the dictionary, because before that, there wasn't a consciousness of why would strangers get in a car together, and how could people middle class and poor afford a limo private service, right? Well, this is essentially bringing the private elite access to autoclaves and injection molding machines and major trucking distribution of pallets down to the engineer that's working at Boeing in Huntsville, Alabama, that's never had an opportunity to access that type of stuff to ideate solutions that could create a better community for him, his family, and then ultimately the world. Other examples of companies we have are, we have a company that is a nuclear waste collection innovation that's focused on using blockchain tokens to facilitate that, because blockchain mining uses an enormous amount of energy, and they're currently building the majority of the plants in the Middle East because they're partnering with natural gas plants, and they want to partner here with the major nuclear waste space in Nevada. So our model is a model out of MIT. It's Simon Johnson, the dean of the business school and former head of the Fed, founded actually wrote a book last year called Jumpstarting America. Jumpstarting America highlights 102 locations that are best for the development of innovation hubs throughout the Southeast and the Midwest of the United States. And our model is to grow through those locations, because he goes through history of why those locations make sense, both historically and currently, based off federal, local, and venture funding, so that public-private partnership needed to actually fuel innovation and bring together communities that don't normally engage with each other. The only way innovation is going to happen and we're going to ideate a better future is the exact same way we did it after World War II, or during World War II. It was all hands on deck. Period.
Yeah, I love
and we're
this.
facing a major catastrophe. I'm from New Orleans, as I pointed out, and I live in Miami, Florida, and according to the IPCC, I was just in Davos at the world in January for WEF, and you know, people flippantly talk about how the places that I'm from are not slated to be here in the next 12 years. And the only way that we're going to save major American cities, major loss of life, is if we stop having a mindset of scarcity and start engaging the American population, the global population, who want to be innovators, right? We have frameworks that identify the best basketball player, the best swimmer, and the best golfer from the age of 4, right? How are we identifying the best scientists? How are we identifying the best mathematicians? How are we identifying the best innovators and giving them access to the equipment? And that's really what our virtual community is about. It's just creating open access. Membership is $99 a month. We just put out a beta test, and like I said, we have 57 members in the community already that are partnering. It's a B2B play, right? So you're not going to make it by, you know, prototyping and during COVID, right? We had companies that use 3D printers to create the adapter for the respirators. And then we learned, okay, we need to bring in some more technical people who ultimately created a mesh network to network 3D printers to do it at a higher volume, because it takes a half a day to print one valve adapter. We shouldn't be in this kind of situation, and we don't have to be in this type of situation if we distribute manufacturing the same way that the shared economy model has benefited the rideshare movement, the same way Airbnb has benefited people to have a place to stay. Our model is very much about how do we distribute access to innovation resources so entrepreneurs can scale rapidly.
Dr. Gibson, what you're pointing out here really harkens back to where we began in a way today, which is America's Best has a narrative
I love this.
of the future. And, you know, this is a narrative of possibility, because I think there's several things that are going on here. We've noticed in this COVID crisis a huge small business crisis. We're wiping out a lot of them, but you're essentially reducing the activation energy to create new businesses by providing these tools, providing the education, finding the market opportunities, and locating them where they can grow. Well, we're going to need a massive, and if we're going to build new small businesses, we might as well not just build the usual service.
And I think, Panway, you made a great point. You know, right after World War II, we injected probably trillions of US dollars today into the economy called the GI Bill. We said, if you were a veteran, we should pay for you to go to college. We think education is important. And that led to the whole rise of us being able to do this new revolution called the computing revolution. And it put money back into all these cities across the country. as people are actually going to the land grant colleges and things like that. And James Fallow wrote a beautiful book about 10,000 miles, and he flew a plane to all these flyover places. What's happening in Sioux Falls, what's happening in Kansas City, what's happening in Louisville, Kentucky, and you actually see huge energy. People are brilliant if we gave them a chance. But your point is access. Even if you worked at a factory, I talked to some engineers at Ford in Detroit. Even if they worked there, someone else had the capital budget for their equipment, the 3D printers and the machines and stuff. So at 5 o'clock, they couldn't use it. They couldn't use it to invent. And the bigger problem was, if someone else owned the capital budget, I wasn't allowed to go in there and use your machine because I might break it. At Autodesk, we had something called Pier 9, where it was sort of this amazing sort of reconfigurable microfactory movement, right? And the whole idea was any Autodesker, 10,000 employees, anybody could take classes. So the anybody could take classes and then use a 5-axis mill, a 3D printer to print biogels and your own stem cells, use robots to manufacture things. So how do we give more open access? That was just an experiment for us because we wanted to observe how people make things, because we make tools to help people make things. But I think what you're doing is amazing. I know, Peter, you probably want to try to sort of balance.
I wanted to just connect this back to what I think are really interesting points for this moment. So we talk a lot about needing circular economies, things that waste less, because ecologically that becomes silly. Well, that's a lot of what you're doing, but also that finds what's uniquely a strength. So it's not, if we have less people costs, less transportation costs, you're finding strengths in this. Local economies also keep wealth within a system. So when we say we don't want extractive capitalism, it probably doesn't look like socialism or authoritarianism. It actually looks like lots of local thriving businesses, which also kind of gets around the political divide, because the right.
I want to jump in just for 1 second. Omid, can you put up the whiteboard for a second? Because I just noticed other people just jumped in and started capturing what I wasn't able to capture. So I didn't put this here. Chris Ledbetter put this stuff here. Some other things were going on. Anyway, it was just fascinating. I didn't do any of this. There's Chris. So he just joined in, and this kind of goes to, if we lower the barrier. I mean, I just said, please help me. And, we were trying to capture what Pondway was saying, right? There's this crazy, this is the context. People being, beaten in Minnesota and destroyed and launching to another planet. That's the context. And how do we actually jumpstart America? How do we do these things? And how do we invite people to tap into the better parts of their nature, to actually strive rather than just be slacktivists sitting on a couch clicking like buttons? And how do we help them feel that? Yeah.
Let me give you another example, tangible, of our space. So in our facility, one of the companies that came to me, it was a graphic designer and I guess he's like an architect by trade. So graphic designer, architect. So white collar, computer ready individuals came to me with the iPad and the idea of building out an electric motorcycle company, right? So they know how to design it and make it look pretty, but they couldn't get it out of the iPad into reality. So what we ended up doing was connecting them to, guess who, blue collar, an electrician and a mechanic, and then university students who worked at one of the local university in the FAU. It has a major battery innovation program, and they were already working on battery technology. And you connect them with the students, right, who then connect to the electrician and mechanic who just need some transitional skills, and all of a sudden you have a team, right?
Yeah,
and so when we talk about breaking down silos and barriers, people often think things like gender or just identity markers, but it's not about that. It's about one of the speakers earlier talked about the migration of industry in the country, and what you have in that is people shifting titles, and in that shift learning how to work together. So when we went from hunter-gatherer to agrarian, some of those were the same people. And then when we went from agrarian to industrial, right, those were the same people who decided to go from the farm to the city. And so the people can shift their skill sets. It's not like there's this major high barrier to entry. And that's another thing that our model brings. So we're very much about low barrier to entry, to innovate and bring products to the market. One of the things that I used to say to investors when I talk to them, because we're, raising capital, is I ask the question, like, how many t-shirt companies do you know of? And how many companies want to create branded water bottles? And everybody knows somebody that's either wanted to create their own t-shirt company at a time or a branded water bottle at a time. And my question is, why do you think that is? It's not because that's the only thing, it's because there's a low barrier to entry to do production in those areas. So why can't we make it a low barrier of entry for people to create their own branded straw companies or their own branded water bottle companies, but now it's made out of a bioresin. So this straw I just showed you is PHA. It's a company that we work with, and it's all organic product. It degrades in less than 90 days as opposed to plastic that degrades never. Yeah. Or paper straws that degrade in your drink right away. So it's an innovation that actually works. You might be asking, why isn't this saturating the market? Because where do you manufacture this in America before Ecotech?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we should bring Eddie. Who else do we have in the green room? I know Evo, I think, had to leave. Yeah, but I'd love to bring in. Do you have Tim Chang and Tim Kring? Yeah, I don't know who we have.
Yeah, hi.
If we're making any progress towards a redemptive story in America or an inclusive heroes journey.
Listen, I see so many connective, sort of connective tissue here with everything that's being said. And for me, I look at everything through the lens of creating, a narrative. And for me, it's really what Dr. Gibson was talking about in her own way is opening up the narrative to your audience, placing your audience in the center and letting them express themselves, thinking about your audience as a scalable commodity and as something that will actually scale up your idea for you, allowing them to have the touch points that they want to go to and allowing them to personally express the things that they're most passionate about, if it's making products, then that's what it is. But we're all talking about the same thing, is somehow giving people the opportunity to share in the story, so that we're not making story for people, but we're making story with them.
Yeah, we're on the journey together somehow. I think that's huge. Yeah, and you talk about opening up the narrative, and you mentioned at Comic-Con, at these other things when you're doing transmedia stuff, people get pretty excited about making their own outfit. I'm probably a Star Trek fan more than a Star Wars fan. So I would want to do things. I'd want to figure out how to make that communicator and figure out and it would be a little crappy the first time. And then I would go and there'd be a costume contest. And then I'd be like, oh my God, all right. Evil Spock wins. Okay, great. And then I would go home and want to get better, right? And I think this is a little bit of where Ponway is talking about. It's not like it's one leap from out-of-work graphic designer, out-of-work or low-paid mechanic or electrical engineer. It's not like one leap to suddenly, hey, I'm Elon Musk. I think it's actually these baby steps of guild building and having faith that people will grow. My nephew came for an internship at Maya a number of years ago, and Maya is a pretty insane immersive lab. And one of the senior designers just took him under a wing, an inventor, and basically kind of beat the heck out of him all summer. Like, no, you got to prototype it. Just prototype it. Let's go. Yeah. And really got him in the mode of it. Today, he's up in Wisconsin, but he has become, he makes every kind of crazy Comic-Con outfit ever because he learned how to just grab a hold of stuff and try it and make it. And now other people talk to him in his community about, can you make that crazy steampunk thing for me? And can whatever. And they find their identity in the messing around a little bit, in the hanging out with like-minded people who are messing around. And I think this feels like, how do we create those narratives?
Yeah, and you have a generation that's growing up believing that they are creators. They're in social media. They're the broadcaster of their own world. They create YouTube channels, and people seem to want to do that, and they seem to know how to do it. And we have to kind of get out of the way. It's sort of like when you first start entertaining at your house, you worry, oh, how am I going to party with? How do I set up a place where everybody's going to have fun? When you get married, you think about the party, how are people going to actually have fun? The truth is, if you have music and you have booze, people actually know how to do this on their own, right? You create the space for it, and people understand how to dance. They don't.
I have a cultural question here. Dr. Gibson, one of the interesting things about this is we're connecting it up to kind of the American story, right? Vannevar Bush is that. If you hear people talk about making America great again, actually it was Vannevar Bush and creating that complex that was great. And the other thing that's going on in here is yours is a very pro-science story at this peculiar moment when science has become politicized, and if you're in one party, you think it's ridiculous. Okay, so there's a set of cultural things that arguably this thing heals because it's both getting back to our core story, and also to Tim, there seems to be the DNA here in some piece of storytelling that isn't being told, and I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on this.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, and I think that my generation, millennials, Gen X, Gen Z, there's facilitate the solutions. A lot of most of my generation doesn't even have TVs. Like, they don't watch the news, they don't have access to CNN, they don't pay attention to this anymore because it's just extremely draining. And there's just more of an interest in implementing solutions, implementing and engaging in results. And we talked about earlier, just innovation is the answer, period. I think that I love to use the example of the whales, and why we still have whales on the planet right now is because not because of education, because Moby Dick taught us that whales were horrible creatures and they deserve to be killed, right? It wasn't because of industry or politics, because it was the whaling industry that made Martha's Vineyard what it is right now. It was the wealthy whalers that were the most wealthy in the beginning of the New England to-do families, right? And they, just like now, lobbied the government to support this as an industry. But it was Thomas Edison who created the incandescent light bulb, and then Lewis Latimer with the filament that made it not explode after 30 minutes, and then GE that came in and said, hey, we're going to spread this out because it's cheaper, it's safer, and it's better. And people liked it more. And I think that's what we're talking about. Once we stop trying to scare people, and really my generation is just like...
No, go ahead. Finish your sentence. I'm sorry. I get excited about this stuff.
Oh, I'm just saying that it's about better products. And once you give people better options in the market, and that's really what we're about, like, just allow people to scale it up so that they can produce that volume, which is what's missing in the economy, because people will make the right choices when they're available. And our thing is just giving them access to those better choices. And once those better choices exist, we won't have to protest in the street. We won't have to change. The laws will change, right? Because look at what Uber did when they came to the scene. Look at what Airbnb did. The laws have to meet them. It just kind of hit us in a second. The same thing with Facebook, the same thing with social media. Technology is the vehicle to really push forward the kind of true capitalism that we say that we want to have as a country, that can create the world that we say that we want, which is more balanced and more equal.
And you're encoded in the technologies you're working with.
Every day.
Yeah. Coded in the technologies you're working with are also what I would call a more humane value system, right? They're distributed, they're local, they're green. They're, just before the whole COVID thing, there was this whole question around Facebook and extraction and what its technologies are doing to us. And you're pointing out that these essential manufacturing technologies can be very local and positive. And that's an important value thing for people to believe in. I want to bring in another guest right now, because this is the greatest three-ring circus of innovation I've seen since COVID started. We're having a blast. Let's have Tim Chang join us. Tim, are you here?
Can you hear me?
Hi, Tim. So, Tim, I think
this is for this so that we could do like limerick building or something with Tim Chang and Tim Kring.
That's right. So we have, what an extraordinary group of people. We have a scientist inventor here. We have a top storyteller here. And we have a venture capitalist who has been on top of a lot of these trends. You and I spoke earlier. You were in an earlier show when we were talking about spirituality and grief. Then you were talking about the contact tracing work you were doing in Bolinas. And yesterday you wrote a post that blew up the internet that kind of brought together the set of technologies and learnings that we're having from COVID that kind of said where these next set of humane technologies are going. I'd love you to share that with us because I think that could start to frame how we work on global innovation. And
we're going to share his Medium post. I think my favorite part of that post, by the way, I loved it, Tim, was ZR, and just like coining that frame. But anyway, please go. This is fun.
Yeah, I shared this link here. This is from my experience, kind of hanging out at Fringe, kind of Burning Man parties and how they're going online, but also hearing pitches and what's going on here. I jokingly called it the Zoom economy. And it's not to say Zoom is the long-term winner, but it's that we're shifting towards this experiential real-time web. And so I kind of was thinking maybe this is kind of like Web 4.0, meaning if Web 1.0 was about networking and linking static pages of hypertext, and then Web 2 was adding in multimedia widgets with audio and video, Web 3, we saw the birth of social and mobile apps, then maybe Web 4 is more about this web of experiences, real-time, interconnected rooms and experiences between people in different formats, maybe different levels of immersiveness. It could be as heavy as VR. It might be something as lightweight as like Online Town, which looks like an 8-bit retro video game, or something similar to like what Phil Rosedale at High Fidelity is now releasing with 360 audio. Maybe it's a Twitch server or a Discord stream, chat session, things like that. But it's going to be a mix of these things that's about real-time interaction. And what I got really excited about is maybe we're moving more towards the conversational internet. And this is where we have more authenticity and vulnerability, maybe trumping reach and virality of carefully curated Instagram posts, right? And maybe intimacy becomes more prized than information. Because like this format, I'm talking to you, this is me. I could have a snap camera filter on and add some more persona, so I'm a talking pickle, but it's not a carefully crafted highlight reel post of me on a boat, humble bragging that ultimately makes you feel bad, right? It's more about this connection, and I'm having a conversation with you. And I feel like maybe we can shift the pendulum back to having more depth in our transactions as opposed to just breadth. It's not about clicks and shares and views and the thing that Facebook and social media is tuned for, which is a whole lot of engagement and addiction to drive ad views. This is really about connection. So I'm really hopeful that we're entering an era where connection surpasses just collection of lots of content.
So,
right?
Tim, you just made me think of something, partly reflecting on when you were on last time, talking a little bit about all the things you're investing in that have to do with inner space, with how do we feel, our well-being, our sense of feeling either self-doubt or agency or curiosity. And I almost feel like, the World's Fair of 100 years ago was to celebrate the Industrial Revolution. It was all about tangible things, the flying cars, the robot kitchens, et cetera. And in a sense, the world of today and the world of tomorrow, we are facing complexity. Can you create a pavilion made out of complexity? Turns out we can't. It's intangible. Can we create a pavilion made out of all these high dimensional problems in quantum computing and AI and all that? How do we even, we're talking about propaganda. How do you hold on to propaganda? It's so slippery. We don't quite know when we fell for it. It's almost like the intangible in the inner space is almost a big part of the next World's Fair. It's the intangibles, the complexities, and how do we actually help people get a sixth sense for complexity in these things, for how, because I do this thing over here in this one factory, it's actually going to affect, because of some down wastewater here, that actually is going to affect someone's livelihood 30 years from now, or it's going to affect something else. And how do we actually understand the real impact of what we're doing? So it feels like inner space could be I think a major part of the pavilions for the World's Fair. Something about the intangibles, because it's all too easy to ignore them until suddenly we're a Russian colony and we're not the United States anymore, or we're something else, depending on where you live in the world.
That's a really interesting point. Peter has talked about this in the past episodes as well, is if we're reskilling people and creating new forms of work, might there be a digital works progress administration? WPA was created during the last Great Depression to put people to work building infrastructure physically. What if it's about digital infrastructure and services now we need to put in place? People that can serve as on-demand chaplains or therapists or space holders or information gatherers, kind of in this Zoom economy, right? Where all services now have to be reimagined to be delivered over formats like Zoom, not just telemedicine, everything.
Well,
Yeah,
I think this is important. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Tim.
It's a digital Peace Corps. I mean, it's a way
Yes,
to
digital Peace Corps. That's it. You nailed it exactly.
I think two things. If you haven't seen the PBS documentary about the Civil Service Corps, right, the whole initiative from World War II, there are grandparents looking out with their grandkids over whole forests that they planted as 18-year-old kids that were out of a job during the Depression. And they kind of, dug dams. They put money in the future in the local economy. It's a wonderful documentary on PBS. But I think this notion of a civil conservation corps for the next generation, how do we do that? And Byron August, who's going to be a guest, he was executive deputy director for Obama's Council for Economic Development. He has been building something that relates to this. If you have a bachelor degree, but you work in a restaurant because you couldn't get a job at this point, you're considered underskilled or overskilled and underpaid. If you are dealing with like social work, you're probably getting paid $12, $15 an hour if you're lucky. If you're doing that actually at a corporation for helping kind of do human resources and things, you're getting paid $45 an hour. And you actually have the same skills. And he has a concept called STARS, which are that you have skills through other routes. You don't have a bachelor, but you've actually honed these skills. And he's building a matching engine. And we're going to share a little bit about this. But he's been working, Reid Hoffman's on his board. He's been working with a bunch of other tech companies to say, remove the bachelor degree from your filter, because it's getting filtered out through algorithms in the submissions for candidates. You're missing out on amazing people that are skilled through other means. 65 million Americans, by the way, are in his database. And he can show how 65 million Americans are stars, skilled through other routes.
Right.
And so I think this relates to exactly what you said. How do we upskill and upward mobility in this whole thing? Too?
I'd love to bring a couple of other our guests back in. When we started today's show, we said there's this massive job to rebuild, to put things back together. And how does we do this with everybody involved? And we've talked about the fact that, Tim, these technologies are more engaging and authentic. And the other Tim, that's a story to be told. And with Dr. Gibson, we can all be involved in this. So I would love to, as we kind of wrap up, although we never wrap up around here.
Do we ever wrap up?
Yeah.
Kick me off. Kick somebody else on.
No, I think there's room. Let's, I don't know how many, let's just keep adding people, see what happens. Jen, can we bring Jen Sander back? Jen, are you here? There you are. Hi. So what I want to start thinking through here is, okay, what if this was a movement or a World's Fair? Or we said in the, the next 9 months or so when people are going to be at home a lot, that's a workforce. And if they're focused on tomorrow and creating things as opposed to kvetching, what might we produce? And I'd love to just get a little conversation on that, because I think that's our collective homework as a society.
Well, I think that it's interesting to think about disruption for a second first, actually, because we talk so much about, how we could do things better or change the way we do things or innovate in how we do things. But what I'd really like to see is something that's been touched on a little bit throughout, is this more kind of ongoing emergence that we can embed into our systems. And I think that one of the interesting ways of sort of looking at how people can start to do that is both from a recovery mindset as well as an ongoing mentality of creation. But there's different things that need to happen before, I think it was touched on also, that people feel like they have the access to it. The entry into the mindset, so to speak. And I think that a lot of that has to do with kind of the linear version of society that we've kind of touched on, the sort of Sir Ken Robinson, what was his quintessential example? It was like a school teacher didn't want a child to be a firefighter. He thought he was wasting his potential. And then the school teacher got into a car accident, and that student who became a firefighter saved his life, sort of thing, and we don't allow people to explore all the different variations of what they want to be from a societal point of view. And so providing this access or permission or lack of options even that we're in right now, really leaning into just coming together to discuss, I think is the catalyst for how that might continue to happen on an ongoing basis.
We're talking about having conversations for possibility or what might be done, or perhaps bridging a divide. You're saying before we get down to the work of building something, there has to be kind of a relatedness and
or entry opportunity for
possibility.
people to even learn. When you look at a blank piece of paper, it's really hard to just draw anything besides a stick man, unless you're Mickey and you clearly are able to doodle beyond everyone else.
All the people I draw look like stickmen. I just do a little squirrel at the top if it's a woman. That's all. That's the best I can do. They're mostly floating heads and squares.
Right. And I think the sort of experience economy that was happening through kind of everyone having experiences, whether you were in fashion, whether you were in tech, whether you were in marketing, coming together to learn and have experiences was starting to happen pre-COVID. But, now what we have is a different type of experiencing. And sometimes that is what helps people re-engage their imagination or their potentials with each other. So I think that what we really need right now is to sort of encourage this vulnerability of trying things and prototyping things, like we said, on an ongoing basis for that to happen.
I wonder what the balance is. There's open-ended exploration, and then one of the things we've done over the last 19 episodes of this is we've seen the clay that we have to work with. We saw what could be accomplished with synthetic biology last week. We've heard from Dr. Gibson today about what can be accomplished with local manufacturing. That, on some level, this also paints the picture of what an economy might look like or where we might go. I'm struck by the point that I made earlier that, like, America seems to be happiest when she believes in a future, or that her kids are going to be better off than the current generation. And this country gets really annoying when we don't see that. And I guess one of the questions is, are there the pieces on the table to start seeing something like that based on the technologies that you're talking about, Dr. Gibson, Tim, the stuff that you and Steve Jurvetson were talking about last week? Is Tim Chang yeah, go ahead. Someone said something.
I really value what Jen said because I believe that it's already happening. So I think COVID and through disruption, if you look at the companies in 2008 that came out of that crisis, Slack, et cetera, right, that's been mentioned on this call, that same type of emergence is going to happen right now. And you won't know who the winners are. I think there's always a desire to be the one that makes the prediction, I guess if you're going to invest in them, that makes a big difference to be able to say, oh, I was one of the first people into this innovation. But I am sure that it is already happening. And 10 years from now, we'll see a different reality. Case in point, the point that Jen just made about reimagining people's role in society and what work looks like. Look at who's essential right now. So there's all kind of conversations happening about, well, hey, if the stock person is essential and the grocery store worker is essential, maybe we should pay them a little more. If the guy who picks up trash is essential and me at my $100,000, I think people are already starting to rethink their value because of what COVID has created. And as a result of that, you're going to see innovations in technology. You're going to see innovations on the web. You're going to see people participating differently. And maybe you'll be the one to make the prediction. My role and what I'm committed to is not necessarily knowing the answer, but being a coach, like being the person that helps to create the ecosystem and the container where innovation can thrive is really all I'm committed to. It's not that I have the answers, it's that I'm an awesome host because I'm from New Orleans and we're just amazing hosts, right? And so how do you create the container and the environment so that people can imagine, not even a reimagining, right? Because it's not like you're doing something from before. It's creating a new world out of a place of abundance as opposed to a place of scarcity. And that's happening. I assure you. We have 26 companies in our space and 57 in the virtual community. We have constant conversations with them and it's extremely inspiring.
But I think what's happening is, by being a good host and by being kind of a coach and a host, sort of saying, hey, you could do this. You're creating a psychological safety net in some ways. You're helping people feel like it's okay, to what Jen said, to actually not be in flow, not be the superstar, actually to be stumbling around and trying something as an amateur, because that's the only way you ever get to be a
Yeah, fail
virtuoso,
forward.
is fail forward. And I think, you know, I think we have a pretty healthy or disrespect for believing futurists could be better than maybe a flipped coin. Because usually they kind of are tech utopians or tech dystopians, and kind of they discount the amazingness of humans, and we should always discount the amazingness of humans and the sort of half-baked craziness of humans at our peril, because humans can surprise us in beautiful ways. Of course they can surprise us in bad ways, but I think in general we're here because a lot of people loved us and they helped us get here, and we have to keep remembering that.
Well,
Go
it's
ahead,
what
Tim.
Tim said earlier. Tim earlier said we're scaling passion and purpose, and that's exactly what we're doing. I mean, that's exactly what has to happen, is you create a container and an environment where you can scale passion and purpose, and there's multiple ways to do that.
Yeah,
I actually have to hop, and I wanted to just say one more thing sort of around this idea that I think is very, you know, what Tim was talking about, of sort of the 4.0, the idea of a more, you know, maybe digital intimacy that is developed out of this idea of people having to connect and use this tool of the internet to figure out how to connect when we're separating. That what it's creating, and even this forum here, is, you know, again, I'm just going back to the storyteller aspect, that the original forum for storytelling and the original platform was the campfire, the sort of digital campfire, right? And the idea that that's where you learned the archetypes that you needed to learn in order to go out in the world. It's from those stories that you learn how to be a warrior or a father or a daughter or a mother. You learn these things through the archetype of these stories. And there's something, not to be too Pollyannish about this, but the idea of people coming together, the interconnectivity of it all, that ideas, you know, perhaps we can start to tell better stories than we've been telling for a while. We can just figure out how to tell better stories. And a big part of that is inclusivity, about people seeing themselves represented in those stories, no matter what part of the sort of social or economic strata they find themselves in. And so anyway, I have to hop because I had a hard out that I've got.
No problem. Thank you so much, Tim. That was wonderful. I think your point is you spend your life creating characters and story arcs where people can feel that they are that character, or they're part of that.
Yeah, they see themselves inside of a character.
I love that.
Through that wish fulfillment, they learn something. And whether it's a cautionary tale of what not to do or something to aspire to, it's the idea of living vicariously through narrative and through stories and archetypes.
Tim, you're leaving. I need to tell you that we're actually going to challenge everybody watching from now until next Wednesday to do a challenge. So I'm going to ask you to, I'll send you an email about it.
Okay.
Do it. It'll take you 5 minutes, but it's actually like an archaeological experiment in weak signals.
Awesome.
So
Thanks,
I just want to flag it because you're leaving. Thanks a lot.
Peter, I'll talk to you soon. And okay.
Honored to share with you all this new stuff to fill up your mind and see what's next. This is we said what we wanted to do today was kind of take people in different domains and connect it up. Let's bring James Hanusa back, and do we have Dan? Is Dan still with us? James, you've been listening to a lot of this, and you're plugged a lot into the similar activist and kind of social communities that Jen is. I know you've had some thoughts on this.
Yeah. You know, Peter, before the show, we talked about kind of what has happened recently. You know, pretty much every festival, concert, conference, etc., the live entertainment industry, higher education, museums, you name it. We're possibly going through a cultural extinction event because of C-19. Case in point, museums are being defunded in Brazil, and I think in many other places. And you know, most of these institutions have, if you're not AEG or something like that, you've got, you know, a budget, maybe a reserve of $10 million or something like that to get you through maybe 3 months, but not 6 months, not 9 months, not a year. So what happens if we lose all of these cultural institutions en masse? We've talked about, you know, the this extinction of animal life on this planet and of biodiversity. But what about cultural diversity? What about cultural institutions, all sinking at the same time? What's that mean to the future? And I think some of the work that we need to be doing together is developing new business models and taking kind of the core ethos and experience that these institutions provide and give the tools and the guides, if you will, to help these institutions, these communities stay alive and eventually thrive. I've been doing this exercise in nation building this month as a artistic practice. I don't know, just for fun. But thinking about
what does that mean?
What are nations?
Yeah, tell us a little bit more what you mean when you say nation building. I've just been doing some nation building the last month.
Yeah. I mean, I had this conversation with the CTO of Estonia back in 2015, and there were some really big key takeaways that he shared with me on the way that they built. It was pre-blockchain technology, basically. Their stack, their what's it called? Their citizenship program. Anyway. Yeah,
but I mean, they're one of the most digital countries in the world, right? Estonia, and at the time, the president of the country actually came from New Jersey, and went back to do it. Yeah, it's amazing because they were getting attacked so much from Cold War fighters. They had to be digital. So you were talking to them about kind of what would you do now versus then? Oh.
No, I actually sat down with the guy. I actually through kind of Burning Man networks, I got the information of how to reach him when I was traveling over there. And he sat down and said, "We remind you why we're here." And I said, "I want to start a new country." And so he walked me through for 5 hours. Like, he's like, "Okay, well, first let me tell you why, and then how, and then if you were actually to try to go do that, like what you should be considering." And so, it went, and the key insight that he shared was that they put their data centers in their embassies around the world so that their data would have diplomatic immunity similar to their ambassadors, etc. And that if they ever were attacked, their 4 million people could flee their national borders and still remain a people. Still hold a culture, still hold a ethos, and go distributed. And I've been playing with that information in my mind for 4 or 5 years, and so now, around some online events that happened this month, Immersiverse, Burns Up Border Summit, the Never Alone Summit, the Remote Burn, created these containers. As Dr. Gibson spoke to earlier, that were just like, okay, classic Burning Man magic, right? Create a container, name it, theme it, invite in creativity. Pretty simple. But, you give it kind of an aspirational North Star, and I always put an S on them, so it wasn't a singular, but it was always meant to be open. So Sonic Nations, Conscious Nations, what else?
But
Nations United was what I think.
A question?
Yeah.
I guess I don't know if I missed something or I'm just not clear, but why is it important to build nations at this point in history? Or is that, I don't understand.
So you do actually, I think, because you talked about the borderless future when you were on the SVBS conversation a little while ago, and you said how some things are going to become kind of like Buckminster Fuller says, right? Throw a better party, or create the system that makes the old one obsolete.
Can I throw a thought in here?
Okay, it's awesome that you say that because my house is a Buckminster Fuller house. So but I'm saying the exact opposite.
Wait, you've got a geodesic dome house?
I want to throw a thought in here, which is we're building something, and what are we building? When we were preparing the show, and I was talking to Dan Mapes over at Versus, he said, I read Tim Chang's post. He's really about building completely digital cities, because here are people thriving and serving each other. There's economy and all this stuff going on. So there is a structure that we're building. And James, when all these groups come together, they're coming together purposely to solve problems in some ecology, right? It's not just an entertainment thing. Something's happening here. Now, Dr. Gibson points out, is it a nation state, which is kind of a big top-down thing, or is it a local, organic, living? We're building something here. And Tim, I'd love your thoughts on this, because that's what we're seeing. There's something organic being built up for change.
Yeah,
give a clarity that nations are just I think actually the creative community, if it sees itself as nation versus community that's global, that it has a shared vision, shared experience, shared values, that's a powerful thing, just to want oneself as such. It doesn't need to have a governance model. It doesn't need to have any other borders or walls or whatever else. But to see oneself as part of something larger, similar to what Mr. Kring said with the HERE project, I think that's a powerful, it's just powerful, that's all. Tim, go ahead. Sorry about that.
I think there's something in here, though, that has to do with self-sovereignty and sovereignty, right? When you say nation, it has to do with sovereignty. It's sovereign borders. It's how do I pick up the garbage every day? How do I put down the highway or the whatever so that I can serve my citizens? And I think a lot of people are not feeling self-sovereign. And so there's probably a thread here that we should pick up on another episode. It really is about how do we actually get past self-doubt and into the point where we actually feel self-agency and self-sovereign over what we have, our domain, at least our house or our home or our family. And then how do we protect ourselves? And so there's kind of an interesting metaphor there with nations.
I was going to
nations
suggest
are invisible and artificial as well, right? You can't find them anywhere. You can only find them if you try to cross a border, but they're artificial. They live in our minds. Tim, what were you going to say?
We're shifting towards that. I was going to suggest, Mickey and Peter, a future topic could be the future of sovereignty and resiliency. Because on the sovereignty part, we are figuring out how to become more our own agents, especially as we have to sense make in this new world, where media and information is now also being weaponized. The resiliency part is through COVID, people realize I can't just rely on the central grid. The infrastructure is becoming more frail. And so the topic on all these WhatsApp threads I'm in now is like, time to go build that commune we've been joking about for years, and for me, I've been learning to grow my own food. It's starting to look at, maybe it is time for solar, going total solar plus Powerwall. And I think everyone's thinking about that resiliency. And then Jen, this is all Burning Man principles, at persistent scale now. So it's no surprise these are all burners who are saying like, we've been preparing for this for a while. So burners
it's also no surprise because Peter is inviting you all. He can't help himself with the Burning Man thing. But I think we also have to be aware that some of those principles had a path dependency, a butterfly that flapped at the very beginning of Burning Man, that may not just magically work in every situation for every culture. But I think there was a lot of learning, right? It's decades old now. Amazing things that Jen and James and others have created with IDEA and other things. It's a crazy experience. And I think you have to stay alive. And I think that's important. My favorite part was seeing people that, seeing a grandchild at 6, with a comb, scooping up glitter with their grandparents, with their whatever, multi-generations there to make sure they didn't leave any speck behind. But there's a self-policing and a trust and a whole thing that didn't just happen overnight. It was an emergent
culture
kind of thing. And you guys tuned it a lot, right? It may seem like it's wide open, but there's a lot of planning before you put a lot of construction in place, or cognitively too, with the streets and everything, before it seems like it's crazy open. And of course the media never depicts that. They depict, sparkle ponies and the jumping shark billionaires and whatever. But I do think, how do we learn from it? But how do we not get stuck in it? How do we not just take that as that's the only way? If it's not this way, it's the highway. And I don't think Burning Man has that attitude, but I think when people who've never been there and don't experience it hear about it, it sounds like kind of like a great excuse for Silicon Valley people and and the European people who just like to smoke in the desert and bum cigarettes to come on over and have some fun. And I'm not saying that's the way it is, but I'm saying, before I went to it, growing up in Chicago and then in Pittsburgh, I was like, Burning Man, really? What is that? Because of course, the propaganda about it is different than the truth of it. So how do we learn from all these different things? That would be the only thing I'd say. I agree. I'm like violently agreeing with you, but I also want to be sensitive about this.
Well, first of all, I think that it's worth noting that when we talk about this moment of unknown, right, of uncertainty that creates vulnerability and discovery and need to create out of lack of resources, whether that's to create an abundant mindset or not, but looking at the situation that we're in, what can catalyze that sense of creativity. And I think it's worth noting that it's really difficult, typically, to go into your city or into your neighborhood and see something you've never seen before. Like, you might not have totally seen it before, but generally speaking, it's not completely unknown. One of the really interesting things about Burning Man is the only consistency is that everything is going to be different, right? And so typically when one has done that, it's been like the great journey, like when you go backpacking as a youth, or the travelers of the Silk Road in pursuit of art and culture and spice and trade. And basically this element of the journey is something that allows us to learn through doing, which is very similar to what Burning Man is, which is learning through doing. And that's what we're talking about here, is trying to bring that kind of agency to our various networks or systems or communities. And I think one of the really interesting arguments for actually I guess the nation, I don't know if I would normally frame it that way, or like the city or the new nation, is going back to what Peter said about the World's Fair. Is actually the interesting thing about the World's Fair, and what I was kind of touching on earlier, is that previously the World's Fair used to be less defined. And the cool thing about that wasn't so much, Mickey, that like Ford would show up with not the whole day of not knowing what to do, but actually what I was referring to more is actually the fact that different nations would bring different things, or different towns or different cities would bring different things, and they would interpret innovation in different ways. And that collective mindset and that individualistic mindset of what was going on in that physical locale or neighborhood then becomes very much so, accelerated, forecasted, shared, collaborated, and catalyzed, right? And it's the same thing that happened on the Silk Road and all the different, to Larry's theme, Caravansary, that Burning Man had 4 or 5 years ago. This idea of exploration of the individual and the collective is very much the takeaway from Burning Man. It's also very much individual agency that we see needing to happen in entrepreneurship or makership or being an artist. And it's also, when we take it from a community mindset, very much locally, to a digital mindset globally, where collaborations.
Yeah. Well, and I'm a big fan. I don't think anyone has to defend it. I think I totally agree with you, though. I think it's the journey and the safe place to have a journey too, in some ways, right? My good friend was a ranger for years, and he was coaching me that basically apply will provide. Like, trust that. Don't be an idiot. But the apply will provide. And I think it it's a camping trip, and if you've gone camping, you probably will be okay. But I think you learn a lot, and I just want more people to be able to take advantage of that. I love the idea of like even the multiverse for, Burning Man has been talking about a virtual version, but you just said something, scarcity of resources, right? Like if the multiverse had physics, like it actually enforced that if you take this thing, it disappears from somewhere else. It's got a resource and nobody else can build with it while you have it. Or it has dust that gets in the mechanisms and stuff starts breaking. Then you'd really be excited about people pulling stuff off. So enforcing aggressive physics, which in interactive systems are called interaction physics, that are sort of invariants, allow for invention as the mother of kind of creativity and stuff. So how do we do that?
So I like that, but I also have an equal and opposite in that constraint, yes, can bring creativity, but what if, I've seen some people talk about like kind of recreating, almost digital twinning Black Rock City virtually. And to me, that's super uninteresting. I think you can drop the scene, blow the roof off and drop the floor and, actually have a experience of abundance that, takes a lot of the rules that as we know them, at least out of the equation. And then what experience do we have when
yeah,
gravity?
no, I agree. When gravity can change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's just the playfulness of games gives you this, right? One of the best games of the last 2 decades or whatever was when you could suddenly shoot a hole in the floor and change gravity, and you fell through it, and so but you want people to be able to bring their skills to it. Was my only point, right? And so physics, it helps us push against the world and learn from the world in powerful ways, right? It's a teacher. I know we're probably way into overtime now, so I just want to be sensitive to everybody's time. This is not the end. That is the beginning. Peter, before we go, at some point, I just want to make sure I give everyone a challenge. I don't know where we're at.
Do that, and then let's talk to everybody and do a kind of a wrap-up thing. Go ahead.
Here's my challenge. Here's the challenge. So, Omid, can you pull up the whiteboard? So this was the first time I invited anybody who happened to be around to draw. And what's interesting is, Tim, I didn't draw you, but I think Chris jumped in and drew it, and he actually went in and so he was just somebody else who jumped in and drew separate drawings. Stardust is kind of a shadowy character over there, and Peter looks like Huey Lewis in the news. I don't know why, but a lot of people created. But if we were to pull back, I want to get to the challenge. So one of the things I've done is this is just this open, infinite, asynchronous whiteboard. So you can see episode 19 when we talked about the bubble and the inevitable with Steve Jurvetson. We can go back and probably find Tim Chang again somewhere back here. We can see leadership in unknown seas. We can see all sorts of things, news, truth, and propaganda. And what I wanted to draw your attention to is I put Post-it notes, these little yellow Post-it notes. I put 3 for each episode. And the mission I want to set for you, not now, but before next Wednesday, and I've made it so that anybody who comes can find the instructions right here, is I want you to do some weak signal archaeology. If you've ever been an amateur archaeologist, you basically like dust away some dust and you find some weird runes and you don't know what they are yet. And so what I'd like everyone to do is try to do some signal archaeology. I've asked people to do this. I had somebody actually joined already, so I'll show you an example of it. Let's see if I can find the example. I'm going to go back in time. I think the example's even further back. Let's see. You can see there are 3 for each episode. Oh, here's one. Okay. So here's your challenge. You just have to find one weak signal. And the idea of a weak signal is that it's not something that you think about all the time. It's not something that's in your face all the time. It's a weak signal. It's that rune that you want to dust off and you want to figure it out. So just double click on the little yellow box and type it in. This person said the importance of games to change. They drew an arrow. It was actually Ting Jiang was talking about games for elders in Holland. Why does it matter? She just answered that. Look at how play can actually shape behavior. Why is it a weak signal? So why do other people not notice it? Why are we not using it? And then if you want bonus, write a haiku or draw a picture. That's just to exercise your skills. So find a blank Post-it. This one's already filled in, but there are 2 more on this episode. And before next Wednesday, just find a weak signal. And bonus points if it's a signal that you didn't come in thinking about, that it was actually a surprise to you, and you detected it. And next week, we're going to have challenge 2. This is the beginning of our co-creation. We're going to do something called silent sort, which allows us to aggregate weak signals together in interesting ways. I'm going to use some methodologies from the Luma Institute to kind of think through this so we can do some co-creation together. So that's it. The link is right on our archive site. It's a little Miro icon. You can click on it. You can either give yourself a name, like Chris Ledbetter's arrow is right there. You can actually see Tyler is over there. There are other people that I probably have known in a really long past life and suddenly, saw this and joined, and they're also guests. And they've been adding pictures, they've been adding other things. But all I'm asking for everyone who's watching, if you're watching it now or tomorrow or the next day, detect a weak signal for us. It's a little bit of our effort to first be some archaeologists. Let's not forget the past. That's all I got.
A charge to set us off to start thinking about what we're building next. By the way, I should tease Friday's show. Friday's show is with Jeremiah Owang, who is one of the great tech analysts, and he's written some really provocative stuff recently around what happens to downtown? Would people take a pay cut if they could work at home? He's just very thoughtful. And his theme is going to be, are we reformatting our OS as a society? Well, we talked about things like reframing or rebooting or restarting, but reformatting means kind of from the ground up. So that'll be an interesting provocation. But I think a lot of what we've talked about today is there's an awful lot of clay and capacity on the table. For example, Tim, in terms of the new communications mechanisms we're building, the new ways we're relating to each other, as we heard from Dr. Gibson today and from Steve Jurvetson and Andrew last week, the technologies that are at once sustainable, manufacturable, and can support us are palpable, but perhaps not as widely appreciated. Although there's been some conversation today that perhaps this generation gets it and just wants to get on with things, and perhaps we're better off than we are. But I mean, that seems to be the conversation. There's a who mentioned, was it you mentioned James Fallows earlier, or
yeah, we're going to have Jim on the show, but it was related to Pondway's comment about the book that she read, which I also captured for our book club, that was Jumpstarting America. And James Fallows did 10,000 miles, A Journey Home. And he and his wife, who's also a journalist and a linguist, flew between small towns with a plane, and they could look overhead and see which factories had cars in the parking lot, which ones didn't. How did they get serviced at that little airport? And they would go off, and each of them wrote a different chapter. And it's kind of stunning. And he's continued this thing. But it's that notion of the beauty of small towns and flyover states is that all the brains are not situated on the coasts at all.
Here's the other thing.
Brains are situated on the planet.
He saw that if you went to any of these cities in America and you said, how's the American government doing? People would say, it sucks. It's not good. And then they say, how are you doing in your town? It's like, we're doing great. We're building stuff. We've got ideas. And so part of what this showed is...
and frankly, blue, red, Republican, Democrat, they basically all have to figure out how to make the town good, and how to turn that old waterway, that was a slaughter yard waterway or whatever, into like a living, thriving place. How to bring back this stuff. So that was the thing. He noticed people weren't having this national conversation in the local parts in some ways. There were, of course, challenges, but it was more about why aren't we really celebrating, the 10,000 miles of our homes?
This was a proof point that perhaps we're moving towards more massively distributed technologies, that local works. Yeah. And, Dr. Gibson, a lot of your work is in opportunity zones, which were all the rage, and then COVID hit. But perhaps there'll be even a bigger rage because there's a bigger, you're nodding.
Yes. Yes, I am. I can address that, but I wanted to weigh in on the previous conversation just a little bit about, so I know this to be true and got it from a guru, but the purpose of life is maturation, right? So the purpose of life is not survival of the fittest. And as you're talking about Burning Man, and as you're talking about people who have any enlightened state, that's ultimately what that realization is. It's like the purpose of life is maturation. And what I said in the previous conversation and why that matters is that the purpose of life is for us to mature into something else. It's not that we have to have an understanding of what's happening in this phase. We just have to have a comfort to head into that next one and be okay as it's happening. And what I believe is happening is that there is, because of technology, because of the blockchain, and because of decentralized currency starting to take over the market, there is going to be a boundaryless reality. And essentially, there's a world. Remember how I couched the beginning of the conversation? You have a protest happening for people claiming that attempting to assert their humanity, and a trip to space, ultimately, hopefully getting us to Mars, where we can start to repopulate other planets, right? At one point, there's a poet, Nikki Giovanni, and Nikki Giovanni has this poem called Quilting of the Black Eyed Peas. And in Quilting of the Black Eyed Peas, she says, we're going to Mars because, I'm paraphrasing, you have to read the form, it's quite humorous, but it gets to a critical point that we're going to Mars because once we identify another species and we murder them and commit the genocide against them that we do to humans, we will realize all of a sudden that we're all human, right? So we are all the same. We are all of the same tribe. We are all human, but we're not at that consciousness yet. Our consciousness is still, I'm from Omaha, I'm from Louisiana. When I meet people, I tell them I'm from Earth. And some people laugh and some people are like, oh, that's cool, but it's just unusual. At some point, that will be the norm. It won't be unusual. And
Yeah.
it's
Well,
technology
and
that's
we're,
going to facilitate that.
but I think it's technology too, but I think this idea of a journey towards maturation, like how do we grow? Because then we will be stronger for the people that we need to take care of, as well as the community around us. So how do we find place to grow and invest in ourselves? I like your journey of maturity. I hope we don't have to. I'm going to have to listen to Nikki Giovanni's poem. I hope we don't have to go kill another alien species before we do it. We're already doing that
Well,
pretty well
hopefully
here.
we'll mature
Yeah,
beyond
yeah.
that need, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
But I think this dichotomy is the scary part, right? Which is why I think we need to face this without averting our eyes or normalizing the fact that this could happen in the same beautiful country that is supposed to form a more perfect union. That meant it's beta, right? Wait, it's not perfect. We've screwed it up a few times. We keep trying, but this idea that we could have, basically police killing on one side and leaving for another planet on another side is a little psycho, and it's a little crazy. And how do we modulate this back to some kind of sanity? And I think you put us in that context, and it was very important.
We may well be approaching the end here, but of course, it's not the end. We have a whole lot more to do. Tim, thank you again for coming back. The post you did yesterday got a great deal of attention. On our the very first time you were on, we were contemplating. Right, it was the very first week that Immersiverse happened, and we were looking at all these new technologies and Zoom, and we knew Zoom fatigue was coming. And what this points out is that there are all of these different behaviors that we've been seeing in the last 10 weeks, and many of them will persist to be a bunch of changes. And the signal that we're trying to divine here, the weak signal that's coming out, is what are the cultural things that may persist, and how might it be more human in this journey, right? And so that kind of connects up this whole question of, if we all believe we're on the same side, which arguably we are with the virus, could that accelerate us? And then how do we start defeating some of this polarization that is kind of heinous? I got a final question, Dr. Gibson, just a contradiction here. Going back to both your family's history in the Manhattan Project and Dr. Bush and science, there is this kind of anti-science thing going around in America right now, and your work is going on in so many communities. Any thoughts on how collectively we just remind us that, like, technology, science, and all this stuff is good? You must think about this some.
I think about how our society is organized, and we're organized around winners. So it's up to the science community, to engineers, to designers to start winning. And then once you start winning, just like the reason people like athletes is because they're winning. And the reason people so scientists need to win. It's their fault. The book also talks about this. So the outcry of the Manhattan Project was horrible, right? And ultimately, that was the end of scientists being considered elite in society. There was this notion where, okay, science can run away with itself because it can also lead to the annihilation. At the end, it was being done to facilitate war. So it was successful at that. Now science gets to have a conscience in the process, and that's the conversation that we're having, and that's the maturation, right? Science back then had no conscience. It was literally just run towards the goal for science's sake. Now we're talking about, how do we do science for scaling passion and purpose of humanity? How do we create innovation that's going to lead to the abundance of life? That's a very different purpose and drive that you're giving the innovation community. And the result from that will hopefully be something what can only be something more powerful and positive than the science of history. So a purpose of life is maturation. Once scientists win and produce solutions to some of these things and business picks them up and those solutions become viable to create a better reality for everybody, because it's about not just humans but animals, plants, like all the living creatures on this planet get to still exist, right? And once that is actually facilitated through innovation, I think then science gets to reclaim a space as an important community in the human reality. But I think it's up to scientists to reprove themselves. We made a major mistake in history, and we get to fix it in our matured reality of having our own sense of self, value, worth, purpose, and commitment, not just that was given to us like the scientists of the past.
Tim, an awful lot of startups sometimes get the rap that young startup tech culture didn't quite get a conscience soon enough. Is history tending towards justice in the tech community?
I'd like to think so. You know, what is nice is necessity's mother invention. We got a whole lot of invention coming up right now. And crisis maybe provides a more refining lens for all of us to have a more clear why behind what we build. In times of prosperity, we're just chasing unicorns and headline and ego gratification. But, you know, when you got shit to fix, I think that provides a whole lot more grounding lens of like, oh, we got real problems to solve. And I hope that means we have a clear why on what we build, more than when times were booming, it's just like 1%er solutions, deliver dog food faster, all that kind of stuff. And I think now people are inspired to work on things that really matter, because we have a lot of stuff that matters to fix.
All right, that does feel like an ending to me. So I want to thank everybody. Look, we end up where we began. We started today saying the world, has spent 10 weeks both looking at the set of problems and realizing the clay, the technology, what we can work with. We said today's show is about how do we all start putting together and working together. And we had a bunch of conversations about communities and nations and what to go build, and the Burning Man communities, the innovation communities. So this is just the beginning. But we not only have a lot of work to do, but I think as a team, us and the broader communities, putting some proposals on the table and cohering some of these efforts is what's up next. Any final comments before we actually get to end?
Fantastic. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Mickey,
for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation and listening to everyone.
Sorry, on the Burning Man channel.
Thanks, everybody.
Can I mention one thing?
Yeah.
Call to culture. So the global summit .org. We are going to be launching on June 1st, I believe, Monday. We have a conversation around thriving cities. And we'll be launching a call for culture. They were originally planned to be held in Tokyo the week in between the Olympics and the Paralympics. Now that those events are postponed, we are exploring a impact Olympics and maybe a cultural Olympics and some other things within that lens. But a global call for culture will be coming out June 1. And I think that really culture is the killer app. And that is, and creativity is going to be what gets us out of this mess we're in right now.
Yeah.
So nice. Hope that folks want to bring it. You'll join us in that call. Thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Why don't you bring up that final slide, and I will thank everybody. We talked a little bit about James Fallows earlier, and in his book, in which he found that so much of the hope in America was local, he had a really interesting definition of what he thought being an American was. And since the slide is not coming out, I'll just read it to you. Maybe it'll come on. He said, being active rather than passive is one working definition of today's American idea, right? The American idea was always one of creation, of balancing both liberty and community, and of co-creation. And you could argue that in the 20th century, in the top-down mass world, we lost some of that because we became dependent on these massive structures, which we've clearly lost a lot of faith in. And perhaps the greatest contribution of this crisis is it highlighted what we lost faith in. It made us more dependent on ourselves. And it made us realize that if we're going to go build a future, it's up to all of us, someone else won't do it. And I think that's what this conversation was about. And perhaps that's the meaning of what the Quarantine is about, as we all become, as Dr. Gibson said, as we're all maturing, as James Fallow says, as we're all being active, as we're finding meaning. So thanks. I'm left slightly unsettled because there's so much to do, and I want to thank such an amazing group for coming together. And we'll see you Friday. It's 6:24 Pacific Quarantine.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we try.